I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about the dramatic resignation of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, we have with us none other than Vincent Rigby, who's a non-resident senior advisor with the Americas Program at CSIS. Vincent worked very closely with Prime Minister Trudeau during a critical part of his administration, serving as the national security and intelligence advisor to the Prime Minister, and in addition to being his personal representative Sherpa at the G20 and G7. So, Vincent, you bring in a lot of experience to talk about what we're going to talk about today. What were some of these events that a lot of Americans were caught off guard? You know, if you're not following what's going on in Canada and the rise of the opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre, you might not have really known that this was coming. And yet this week, Monday, really shocking for a lot of people, Justin Trudeau resigned. But I guess not that shocking to you.
No, it's a good way of putting it. I think that internationally, outside Canada, there was a great deal of shock, a lot of surprise, like, whoa, didn't expect that to happen. I'd say in Canada, there was less shock. People were still taken aback at how sudden it was, but it was almost like a slow burn that then suddenly exploded. And so the Prime Minister's popularity ratings have been quite low for quite a while. He'd won a majority in 2015. He couldn't ever secure another majority. He got a minority in 2019. He got a minority in 2021. His polling numbers were coming down. He was very, very unpopular. Any prime minister in Canada, any leader anywhere, right, after a number of years, their popularity starts to fade. And he was becoming, quite frankly, for a lot of Canadians, just unacceptable as the prime minister. And so there was a lot of talk about him potentially stepping aside. There was a pressure building within the Liberal Party for him to step aside. A lot of MPs were starting to talk out, some quite openly, others a little bit more in a clandestine fashion, not necessarily putting the names out there, but whisper, 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 I think it's time for the prime minister to go. But the straw that broke the camel's back, of course, was the resignation of his deputy prime minister and finance minister, Chrystia Freeland. And so that was the shock.
Right, because she was so loyal to him. And we here in Washington know Chrystia pretty well. She was a prominent journalist before she went home to her native Canada and started working in politics. That was also shocking. I mean, pretty unusual to see a New York Times headline, Chrystia Freeland, deputy prime minister of Canada, resigns.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. I mean, she resigned because of a controversy over her role as the finance minister. And I can talk about that in a second. But yeah, she was very loyal, I think, to him, a very competent minister. I had a chance to work with her when I was the associate deputy minister at Global Affairs Canada. So I had some direct dealings with her. Very smart lady and a very competent minister. But there were rumblings that there were disagreements between the prime minister and Chrystia Freeland, suggestions that they weren't on the same page, how to address inflation, how to address the economic crisis, how to address things like President Trump threatening to impose 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. And so it seemed to be building and building. There were rumors that there were disputes between PMO and the minister, and all this is out in the public domain. And then finally, what we can gather from reporting is that she was about to give an economic statement just before Christmas on a Monday, and that the prime minister Zoomed her on the Friday to say, looking forward to your economic statement. But by the way, you're going to be out of the finance minister's portfolio right after that. And I'm bringing in Mark Carney, who is the former governor of the Bank of Canada and also the governor of the Bank of England. So this is apparently what happened. Nobody knows the real truth, but this is what's reported in the press. And pretty interesting turn of events, if that's the way it was, because she was about to give this major economic statement. It's called the Fall Economic Statement, where she basically lays out the state of the economy, new measures, et cetera, et cetera. But then she mulls it over on the weekend and she wakes up on Monday morning. She goes, you know what? I'm not sticking around. And so she wrote a letter. It went public. And it basically said that this is what you said to me on Friday. I'm stepping down. I'm stepping out of the cabinet. I'm not even going to be your deputy prime minister, let alone your finance minister. She took a couple of shots at him, including that, some of his economic measures recently had been cheap political gimmicks, I think the phrase was, and that at a time when we should be focusing on President-elect Trump's potential measures and what this could mean for the Canadian economy, we weren't focused on the prize. We didn't have our eyes on the prize. And so she left. And so that's what set off this chain. And then the unpopularity within his own party that I was talking about before, it just mushroomed. And then it was like, okay, more and more people came out in the caucus to basically say it's time. and we got to move on. And we got Poilievre, as you say, waiting in the wings to take us on here. We need to get our act together. And so he said that he was going to take the Christmas holidays to mull it over, and he came back. And then he made that announcement. And so, like I said, it was a slow burn for quite a number of months. And then it was off to the races. And it happened really, really, really quickly over the course of, about a week or two.
Yeah. And for context, Americans may not follow this that closely, but Canada, despite being the nicest place in the world, has a history of turning away, kicking out their prime ministers after they serve about 10 years. And we've seen that in succession with a number of leaders. So now it's Trudeau's turn. And look, polls show that only 34% of Canadians say that they're currently proud to be Canadian. So that can't be good for a sitting prime minister with a minority, even one as charismatic as Trudeau.
No, I think that's fair. The polls, whether they're polls like that or polls around his personal leadership or polls for the Liberal Party, I mean, I think he was looking at those polls. I mean, the most recent had him or his government's popularity at around 20%. And even since his resignation, it's still around 20%. It may have gone up a percentage point or two. So it may not just be him, it may be his government. And Poilievre is about 47, 48%. If I think the election were to be held tomorrow, we're not even sure that the Liberals would be the official opposition. It might be the Bloc Québécois, the Quebec Regional Party. And the most recent projections are suggesting that the Liberals would get about 35 seats. So they'd be in deep, deep trouble. That would be as big a whack to a government as, not as big, but in the same territory as Brian Mulroney giving up power, as you said, to Kim Campbell in 1993. And the Conservatives were reduced to 2 seats in the House. So that was the ultimate shellacking of any government, but this wouldn't be too far behind. And it's kind of ironic because when Prime Minister Trudeau took over the party in 2013, the party was in that kind of shape. They didn't have any seats in the House of Commons. It wasn't very united. And he brought it together and won the 2015 election. But then as he leaves, it's almost like it's come full circle. And so it could be in as bad a shape as it was back in 2010, the last election, when I think they won again a handful of seats.
It's interesting because we live in a hyper-polarized country here in the United States, and Canada has also become hyper-polarized. Some of the issues that really have set this notion that Trudeau needed to go was his immigration policies.
Mm-hmm.
The economy, of course, carbon tax, as Pierre Poilievre would say it, a culture of wokeism. Tell us about all that, because once you dive into it a little bit, it sounds very similar to some of the stuff that's going on here in the United States.
Well, I think Canada's not unlike other countries around the globe. And the Prime Minister's even admitted that there is a wave of populism around the world at the moment, and we've been experiencing that. So this has been a government that's been quite progressive in nature, quite left-leaning, and it has rubbed some people up the wrong way.
And Trudeau's really the ultimate progressive icon globally.
He is. And when he came into power in 2015, he was a rock star. I traveled with him late 2015 to a G20 summit, and he was a rock star. People wanted to have selfies with him. I remember thinking, this is almost like the Beatles. It's quite something. And it was because of that progressive image that he had, young, and it announced a cabinet that was going to have complete gender parity, one of the first, if not the first ever in the world. And all of his policies that you mentioned, I think were moving that way. But as so often happens, over time, became less popular because of policies, because of some ethical issues, SNC Lavalin, possible government interference, prime ministerial interference, and that, some potential lapses in judgment with respect to some travel, those kinds of things. And I think just a general tiring, like I said before, after 9-10 years, we've seen enough of this guy. And that's what tends to happen. We've got 2 terms down in the US. We don't have that here. He's won 3 elections. He's been there a long time. I think there's only a handful of prime ministers who've been there longer than him. It's like 6 or 7, if that. So he's been there a long time. So all kinds of comments already. He isn't even gone yet. He's still the prime minister, but his legacy. And there will be a lot of the comments that you just made about wokeism and too far to the left. And he was a fake feminist, and he wasn't this, he wasn't that. But he did some good things too. And I mean, I'm happy to talk about some of those good things. And I want it to be as balanced as possible.
I want to get to that because, I've seen a lot of commentary that despite what's going on now, Trudeau has left Canada much better off than before he came. But before we do that, let's talk about the immigration issue. Why has that become so divisive in Canada? Trudeau obviously embraced a pretty aggressive immigration policy bringing in a lot of immigrants every year to replace Canada's small workforce. Can you explain that whole dynamic?
Well, I think what it's come down to, and I'm not an immigration expert, but I have followed the file and played in it a little bit. I was the Associate Deputy Minister of Public Safety when we had the issue at Roxham Road, refugee claimants coming across the border in Quebec, and that became a huge issue in Canada. It's, I think, become a real hot button issue over the last year to 2 years, directly linked to housing and other economic issues. You know what happens when these debates start to take off around immigration. They're stealing jobs, they're stealing our housing, and we're letting them in. But what about Canadians who are here right now, Canadian citizens who don't have access to affordable housing? And so, he's taken steps recently to reverse field a little bit on that, but I think it's come for the Canadian population a little bit too little and too late. And so it hasn't gained traction. So that will be something that I think in an election campaign is going to be big. Poilievre will play on that. We got to bring the numbers down in terms of immigration. We've got to put a cap on that. But like any country, right? I mean, look at the United States. It's an issue. He's probably paid for it politically, without a doubt. I mean, you'll talk to economists who say there are good reasons why we bring in the number of immigrants that we do. We have to make sure that the right type of immigrants, right, that actually build productivity and encourage the economy. And that's where the debate is, to what extent that's really happened.
Vincent, let me ask you, what are some of the great things that Trudeau did during his time, and how did he really shape Canada over these last 10 years?
I think two of his greatest legacies were related to, one, Canada-US relations, which might surprise you, given everything that's been happening recently, and the second to the pandemic. He managed the Canada-US relationship during a very difficult time when President Trump was in power. And that relationship could have gone south, no pun intended, in a major, major way.
Sure.
I think he actually handled it quite adroitly. You'll recall the CUSMA, we call it CUSMA up here, Canada, US, Mexico trade agreement. Trump was a hard negotiator. He wanted to give it to us. He wanted to really stick it in us. And he fought hard. He fought hard.
USMCA.
Your version of it. He fought hard. And his lead negotiator was Chrystia Freeland. You were talking before about trust and about loyalty. She was front and center on that file. But we got a good deal that I think was in Canada's interests. You'll recall that the US imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, pushed back on that. I think President Trump tried to bait him on numerous occasions, like he often does with other leaders, with some very personal comments about how he was a weak leader. After the G7 summit in Quebec, he just let that go right off him. He managed that relationship so that by the time that Biden came back into power, it was in pretty good shape. I mean, he could have taken the bait. He could have lost it with him, and it would have suffered. I think the relationship would have suffered. So I think he handled that relationship very well. I thought he was extraordinary during the pandemic, to be honest with you. I mean, this is a hot button issue in Canada as well, led to the Freedom Convoy and questions over vaccine mandates and freedoms of expression, so on and so forth. But if you look at how Canada fared during the pandemic, and I was his national security intelligence advisor for the first 18 months, 24 months of that. If you look how we compared to other countries, including the US and the UK, other G7 states, we did very well in terms of vaccinations. We did very well in terms of supporting our populations. It was impressive. Ironically enough, as well as he did, I don't think he's ever recovered from the pandemic in terms of what it did to the country, what it did to the economy and the recovery. That was almost like a mortal wound that he took there. It wasn't a flesh wound. And a lot of leaders have had to suffer that. But I think the government did exceptionally well. I saw it up close and I participated in some of the measures. So I thought he did well. Others will point to some of his domestic policies, dental care and child care benefits and child care and things like that, and lots of other things on the domestic side. But if we get into Canada's role in the world stage over the last 10 years, defense policy, foreign policy, not so good, I would suggest, and his legacy may not be a strong one.
Let me ask you this. What happens next? So Trudeau has resigned, but we don't expect there'll actually be an election until certainly after the Progressives choose their new leader. Are we looking at spring? Are we looking at next fall? What happens next? Is there just this period of lame duck? Or
this is where it's gotten quite controversial and where Canadians have gotten even more upset with him, because what he basically did, he went to the Governor General, the King's representative here in Canada, and he said, I want to prorogue Parliament. What that means is I want to shut Parliament down. And I want to shut Parliament down while my party goes off and chooses another leader. So Parliament's been prorogued until the end of March, which means that nothing can really get done over the next few months. You do have a lame duck prime minister. You have a president coming in January 20th who's going to be dealing with a lame duck prime minister for 2-3 months. And so a lot of people have been accusing him of, well, you're just really looking after your party. You don't care about the country. So that's, I think, made the water boil even hotter, if I can say it that way.
Yeah.
So what happens is Parliament comes back at the end of March. We hope that a Liberal leader will have been chosen by then. They're trying to figure out the rules and regulations of that race right now as to a replacement for the Prime Minister. When they come back with a new leader, hopefully, they will have to go into the House of Commons and they'll either give her a speech from the throne, which is where the government sets out its priorities for its coming mandate, or they may have a vote on supply, which is Parliament approving money to various departments to carry out the activities. Either of those is going to end up in a confidence vote, which means it goes to Parliament and the other parties will, along with the government, will vote on whether to pass it or not. And he is in a minority position. He no longer has the support of the New Democratic Party. So he will, in all likelihood, his government will, in all likelihood, get voted out of power at that time. And there will then be an election. The election will probably be held sometime in May, I would think, or thereabouts. So we will likely have a new prime minister or a new old prime minister, if I can put it that way, if the Liberals win. Unlikely, but you never know, by, I'd say, June, before the summer.
Tell me about the opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre, conservative, bit of a firebrand by Canadian standards. Interesting guy. He's not a complete traditional conservative. He favors same-sex marriage. He favors abortion rights. Tell me about him and why he's so popular now.
Well, I think, again, he's riding this wave of populism. And so he's exploiting that. He's saying all the right things in terms of really appealing to that side of the Canadian voting population right now. You know, he's been compared to President Trump as a populist, our own Canadian version of President Trump. I think that's an oversimplification. And what you've just said in terms of some of the nuances in his policy stances, I think points to that. You know, and he's been quite clear in some of his statements, you know, about Canada's the 51st state of the US and so on and so forth. He's not going to buy into that. So the extent to which he and Trump are going to get along, I don't think it's going to be fundamentally different. I think that there'll probably be loggerheads on a lot of different issues. What I find interesting about Poilievre, so he's a populist and he's a bit of a firebrand. He speaks his mind. He's very, very articulate. He's very, very quick on his feet. But a lot of what he's done over the last couple of years is attack the prime minister, attack the government. And so I think we're still waiting to a considerable extent to hear what he actually wants to do with the country. What are his policies going to be? So that it's very easy to take pot shots at the current government. It's very easy to criticize. But what's going to be interesting now is that with the prime minister stepping down, it's time for him to shimmy up to the bar.
Yeah, how's he going to govern?
Exactly. Let us know what you want to order here. Like, what are you going to do in terms of economic policy? What are you going to do in terms of defense policy? What are you going to do with the Americans? So this will be interesting. We'll see where it goes, because if you ask, you know, a lot of Canadians, what is his policy on this? What is his policy on that? They don't know. And that's because he hasn't pronounced it very clearly.
So what are the ramifications for US-Canada relations given all of this?
Well, I think in the short term, like I said, we've got a lame duck prime minister now, so that when President Trump steps to power in the 20th of January, you're still going to have Prime Minister Trudeau there. You know, he, I think, is very focused on the issue still. I know the prime minister, he will work hard. He will continue to work hard on these issues. He has a cabinet committee on Canada-US relations, which is meeting twice a week. His finance minister, Dominic LeBlanc, who's not going to run in the competition for the job of prime minister, he'll be very focused on the Canada-US issue as well, because he's the point man. So they're going to work hard on it. But, you know, Trump's going to be looking at this and going, do I really take this guy seriously right now? I think we all know what he thinks of the prime minister, given his public rhetoric. Again, he'd probably be doing that with any leader, but I think it's become maybe a little bit personal with the prime minister. But he's lame duck. And I don't know how seriously he's going to be taken. So that's the short term. In terms of the long term, I mean, I think I've said this before, whether it's Prime Minister Trudeau, Prime Minister Poilievre, I'd even said it that if the Democrats had come back into power and Harris had come back into power, that the Canada-US relationship was in for some troubled waters. And that the U.S. was going to be looking to renegotiate the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement. They're going to be looking for us to pick up our game on defense, looking for us to do more in the world. They're going to be talking to us about critical minerals, energy, all these things. It was a relationship about to go down a bumpy road. Now that you got President Trump coming in, doesn't matter who the prime minister is, it's going to be a rough ride. It's going to be a very rough ride.
So if you're a national security advisor advising the prime minister, whether it's Trudeau or Poilievre or someone else, how do you advise on US-Canada relations when there's a lot of noise coming from the Trump folks that Canada should be the 51st state, which, you know, is completely unrealistic, I guess, and maybe he's joking. We don't really know. But then also on issues like the Arctic and Greenland, which seem a lot more real. What do you tell the prime minister about this?
I was having a conversation with my students at McGill yesterday where I teach, and they're asking the same question. I mean, is he serious? Is he serious about invading Canada, although he hasn't used that word, although he has talked about taking Canada by economic force? Is he serious about Canada becoming a 51st state? No, I don't think he is. And I don't think we should be concerned that he is going to start sending tanks across the border or F-35s raining munitions down on us or anything like that. And I said to my students, I honestly don't think that anybody in the Department of National Defense right now in Canada is drawing up war plans for the United States. I don't think. I could be wrong. Who knows? The military love to do contingency planning. So maybe they've already got them. I don't know.
Love war games.
I don't think they had them when I was there. So I don't think there's a threat anytime soon of the U.S. making a real go at trying to take over Canada. But I would say that it's not just him blowing off steam and saying stupid stuff off the cuff and not thinking about it. It may be ridiculous what he's saying, but I think there's method to his madness. And I was saying to my students that it's a little bit like a SWAT team that's about to go into a building that's been taken over by terrorists or somebody robbing a bank. And you throw in a couple of stun grenades, those things you see in movies all the time where it doesn't kill anybody, doesn't maim anybody, but it concusses you and disorients you and lots of smoke and debris falling on your head and you're all confused. And then you go in. And so call it that, call it the first volley, call it the warning shot across Canada's bow. That's what this is. This is a lot of noise. But then when the serious negotiations start, I don't think he's going to start off those negotiations by saying, I really do want to take over Canada. But I think what's going to be in the back of every Canadian's mind is he's already said this stuff. He's already said that stuff. Who knows? And so it just creates a seed of doubt in the back of your mind as to what's going to come next. And I think he's probably sitting back right now, quite pleased with himself because he sees what's happening. He sees the comments that are coming out. Trudeau saying, it'll be a cold day in hell before Canada becomes part of the United States. We turned around after he made the comment about all the fentanyl coming across the border and illegal immigrants. Canada came up with the $1.3 billion border security plan. We're moving. We're doing stuff. And so whether it results in positive action like that or it results in holy crap and a lot of confusion and people waving their hands, he's happy either way, I think. So how do you respond to that? Well, you don't take it too seriously, but you don't dismiss it altogether.
How seriously do you take Greenland?
Well, that's going to be an interesting one. We all know that is a strategic piece of land, and the U.S. has had military assets there for a while. He talked about this the last term. This is not new at all. He speculated about it.
Right.
This time he seems a little bit more serious. Really interesting that he sends, I think, his son down there. Saw the aircraft parked on some runway in Greenland. I don't think, again, he's going to do it by force. I noticed that the Danish president, the leader, said the other day that this is not going to happen. The Greenland leader said the same thing. It's not going to happen. Even the Germans spoke out the last couple of days, said, come on, this is ridiculous. But again, I suspect maybe he wants more concessions. Maybe he wants to have more assets there. I don't know. It's part of a strategy. But whether it's Greenland or it's Panama, he throws that stuff out there. I don't know where it's going to land. He might be a little bit more serious than he is with Canada because, Canada would be a lot more to bite off, to put it mildly. But with him, I don't know. I don't think he's serious in the end, but I suspect sometimes he's just testing the water a little bit. And let's see where this goes.
Vincent, this has been fascinating. Thank you for your insights, and we really appreciate it. I'm sure we will be talking again once things in Canada straighten out a little bit.
My pleasure. Look forward to it.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.